This is the Naked Mormon History Travel Log for April 1st. Happy April Fools, everybody. 2017. Wow, a lot happened today. So we began the day by going to the Isaac Morley farm, and it is a complete recreation. So the Morley farm, it's contended whether or not the Morley farm, as it is a church historic site, actually exists on the Morley plot, and there's no way really to know that. The missionaries who I've been kind of traveling around here with contend that the farm is actually one plot west of where it actually sits, where the historic site sits. But the church owns what they have as today their Morley Farm historic site, and it was interesting to go there, and there's not really anything there other than just a small home where some missionaries live, and this little pylon, I guess, type of thing where you can go and sit under a sheltered area on some benches and they can tell you the stories. But it's not open during this time of year, and it was really nice that the missionaries that were working the Isaac Morley farm were nice enough to take a special occasion and meet with us this morning. So we all went there and met with the two elderly missionaries there, and they told us all of the miraculous stories about the Isaac Morley farm, and including the story of Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who, I guess I'll just kind of tell the story. So Isaac Morley was somebody, a member of Sidney Rigdon's congregation, and he was also the owner of the Morley farm, where there were various people living on these hastily thrown up little log cabins, essentially. The Whitmer family, when they moved from Fayette to Kirtland area, they began living there. I believe the Smith family lived there for a short time. Joseph Smith and Emma lived there, as well as the bigger Smith family. Some really impressive stuff happened. But as the story goes with Mary Elizabeth Rollins, she wanted to read the Book of Mormon, and she heard that Isaac Morley was given a copy or purchased a copy of the Book of Mormon. So she went up to Isaac and said, I want to read this book. She was, 5 years old or something at the time. And Isaac Morley said, well, this is my only copy. I'll give it to you for the night, but bring it back tomorrow morning so that it can be here for tomorrow. I don't know what tomorrow was exactly. So she took the Book of Mormon home, and her family read through the first book of Nephi, and she memorized the first verse. I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, blah, blah, blah. And when she came back in the morning, before the Morleys even were having breakfast, she handed the Book of Mormon back to Isaac Morley, and he said, well, I bet you didn't read any of it. And she recited the first verse and then proceeded to tell all about the Nephi and Lehi family. And it surprised Isaac Morley so much that he said, you know what, I think you need this book more than I. And he gave her the copy of the Book of Mormon, which Joseph Smith later, when he came to visit the Rollins family, he saw the Book of Mormon there and said, I gave that copy to Isaac, or to Brother Morley. Why is it here? And then he met Mary Elizabeth Rollins, who would later become one of his wives. And of course, Mary Elizabeth Rollins was also one of the two girls who gathered the papers of the Book of Commandments in Independence, Missouri, as they were burning down the printing press and throwing out the typeset out of the windows in 1833. So she's a very important person in Mormon history. And it just so happens that we were attending there with an 11-year-old girl. And the sister missionary that was telling us this story essentially said, I'm going to talk to you because you're close to the age that Mary Elizabeth was when this all went down. And she spent the entire time talking to this girl that was part of the tour group. And it was interesting to see the sister missionary's ability to invoke emotive responses out of this 11-year-old girl, because she personalized the story and made it seem much more real to this young girl that was part of the tour group. Fascinating, to say the least. And I have very conflicting perspectives of well, I don't know. I don't know exactly how to wrestle with it in my mind, but it just really speaks to the broader motives that are captured around here, and the mechanism by which the missionaries have been telling these stories and trying to apply them to, personal aspects and turn them into emotional experiences when they're just telling historical stories. It was fascinating, and we proceeded then to walk through the Morley farm up to where they assume there was one cabin that was established as a schoolhouse, essentially. This is the same schoolhouse where Jesse Jasper Moss tried to steal a bottle of the wine because he thought that the wine was drugged, because they were having all night long ceremonies in this little schoolhouse. Joseph Smith and the Morleys and other members that were living on the Morley farm. So there's a lot of history captured in the Isaac Morley farm. And then eventually Joseph Smith told Morley to sell the farm and to move to Kirtland, and then eventually to move out to Missouri. And after the Saints were chased out of Missouri, Isaac Morley settled a farm in Illinois, and it was called Yellroom. The farm that he founded was called Yellroom, which is just a palindrome of Morley. Well, I guess palindrome implies similarity in both directions, so it's just Morley. Yellroom is Morley backwards. How's that for you? So Isaac Morley is a very important person in Mormon history, and he was a part of Sidney Rigdon's congregation and was the only person that I'm aware of that was actively practicing communalism. Where the people living on his farm essentially contributed all of their goods to Isaac Morley, and he rolled those contributions into bettering the lives of the individuals who are living there. It's an interesting ideal, and apparently, as a sister missionary said, he was just practicing for the law of consecration to come into place so that he would be able to readily accept that. I don't know what else to say about Isaac Morley. There's a lot of history packed into that one person. So after the Isaac Morley farm, I came back into Kirtland because they're a mile and a half apart or something to that effect. Came into Kirtland, and I attended the basement to belfry tour of the Kirtland Temple. And wow. If you are ever in Kirtland, the Community of Christ who owns the Kirtland Temple, they offer a $5 tour, and then they offer an increased dollar amount tour for the basement to belfry tour. And during that tour, you actually go into the basement and look at the structure of the temple, and they tell you a lot more about the history and the construction of the temple. And then they go through all of the levels and tell all about the history, and then they end up in the belfry tower, where you are standing essentially on this one pinnacle point overlooking all of historic Kirtland. And they don't allow you to take any pictures, both in the Community of Christ Visitor Center, in their museum portion, and in the temple. They don't allow any pictures in there. But when you're up in the belfry tower, they allow you to take pictures of Kirtland all around. And of course, you can take as many pictures of the outside of the building as you want. And I did. I took a bunch of pictures, and even took a 360 video around the grounds there, around the temple, and that will be coming out eventually. I'm not sure when I'll get that one aired out. But it was an interesting tour. The history packed into Kirtland Temple is incredibly compelling. And I go through a lot of the history and the construction of it in the 360 video, so I won't spoil too many of the details now or belabor the points now. But essentially, the one takeaway that I'm able to bring with me after the tour was They had no idea what they were doing. They were just building this huge building. That's all that the saints were doing. And then thanks to an architect that the saints brought down from Canada, they were able to actually build a structure that was going to withstand the elements for, well, now 180 years. It's amazing. It is just such an amazing building. And the amount of history that's captured in that one little building, one big building, it's the biggest building that I've seen in Kirtland so far, is absolutely incredible. That's where they held the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, and where they were, in my opinion, freely imbibing in wine, and that may have been tainted with something else, and they were experiencing powerful visions or hallucinations, as some may call it. So the Kirtland Temple, I cannot recommend it highly enough. And if you have the chance, if you're ever in Kirtland, please do the Basement to Belfry tour. It is a little more expensive, but as the missionaries around here say, and as the people in the Community of Christ say, all of the mission tours put on by the Brighamite Church around here are free. They just cost you 10% of everything you have, 10% of your income. Whereas you're going to pay the Community of Christ some money to go through this tour, but you're not giving them your tithing. So it's worth it. It is absolutely worth it. Please do the Kirtland Temple tour. And the proceeds from the tours wrap into the upkeep of the building. And they have had to, over the many decades that the Community of Christ has owned the temple, and the RLDS Church before it was turned into the Community of Christ to own it, they've had to do incredible amounts of very expensive structural improvements to keep the building even standing. They had to re-stucco all of the siding because that was all falling down. They've had to reinforce the foundation of it because the people who were building it completely screwed everything up. I mean, it's absolutely incredible the amount of work the Community of Christ has put into this building without the means to do it. And of course, if you go through the tour guides will tell you much more detailed accounts of everything that they went through. But the temple tour was fantastic. And then after the temple tour, I made a beeline to go to a meeting that I had set up with a man named Karl Anderson, Karl Rix Anderson. That name may ring a bell for some of you, and I've pulled up his page on Deseret Book here because he's written 3 books. The first one was Teaching and Commentaries on the Doctrine and Covenants. The second was Joseph Smith's Kirtland, and then the third one is The Savior in Kirtland. Essentially, Karl Anderson has been teaching Mormon history and been a Mormon historian for decades now. He spent 25 years in the church educational system and taught 15 years of Institute. He taught Institute for 25 years and taught early morning seminary for 15 years. I'm taking this off his Wikipedia page. Take that for what it's worth. He's also served as secretary of the Joseph and Hiram Smith Foundation. He's received many awards for his historical works. And around here, and probably in the broader Mormon historical community, he is referred to as Mr. Kirtland because he's one of the foremost experts on Kirtland. So he was nice enough to invite me into his home, where we had a conversation that he said we need to be done with in about an hour, and it went almost an hour and 45 minutes because we were both just talking each other's ears off. Unfortunately, he did not consent to be recorded. I tried to get him to agree to be aired on the podcast, and that wasn't going to happen. Very simply, he said that he things come out in conversations that he doesn't necessarily want aired. So that's totally all right. I have no problem if somebody doesn't consent to being recorded. I will not do it, and that's totally okay. But I will recount my side of the conversation as I saw it, and my perception of the conversation, because it was enlightening to say the least, and amazing, indescribably amazing. I mean, anybody who listens to the Naked Mormonism podcast knows that I love to talk to Mormon historians. We get into deep conversations, and I can't stop asking questions. I can't stop arguing with them. I mean, arguing is kind of used as a broad term in that respect, but Mormon history is such a broad topic, and it's hard to cover in just an hour and a half long conversation. And Anderson was so open and insightful and happy to share his knowledge and scholarship and expertise. And it may have to do with the missionaries that I'm staying with. He thinks very, very highly of them, and I happen to share the last name. So he opened his home to me and opened his brain to me in ways that I simply can't describe, but I'll try and recount the conversation as best I can. We began the conversation with kind of discussing the broader implications of Mormon history that hinged upon Kirtland, Ohio. He said that, with the exception of the Utah, Kirtland was where Joseph spent the most time as prophet of the church, and more doctrines, more revelations came through Kirtland than in any other place. More spiritual manifestations happened here than anywhere else. That includes long before the Book of Mormon and, before Joseph moved to Kirtland, and that includes the Missouri and Nauvoo years. More manifestations happened here. 63, I think it is, or 65 of the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants were in just Kirtland. That doesn't even include the outerlying areas, Hiram and Amherst and so on and so forth. That's just in Kirtland. And God, what else do I say? I mean, the powerful amount of history that hinges just on Kirtland alone is just, there's no way to possibly quantify it. But then we talked a little bit about his books, and I prefaced the conversation by saying, you'll have to forgive me that I haven't read your books yet, and I plan on reading them soon. But I'm going into this conversation ignorant, essentially, clean slate. So he wrote Joseph Smith's Kirtland, which is a powerful historiography. And then Neil A. Maxwell, who was an apostle of the church when the book was released, told Anderson that he needs to write Jesus Christ in Kirtland. And essentially Anderson said, I'll get around to it. And then Maxwell said, yeah, no, you need to write this book. And he wrote the book that is Christ in Kirtland. And it wraps all of the revelations of Jesus Christ and of the prophets of old in the Old Testament and wraps them into a timeline into Kirtland. And essentially all of the priesthood keys were ordained through the Kirtland Temple. That's where the various prophets of old manifested themselves to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and conferred the keys of the priesthood to Joseph Smith. And, without the Kirtland Temple, it was Jesus's plan all along to have the Kirtland Temple built, and once the keys were attained, then the saints could be chased out of Kirtland, and that was all part of Jesus's plan, or God's plan. And he walked me through this entire line of logic, and I would sell everything short if I tried to recount it. So I'll have to read through his book and get back to everybody on it, because essentially he walked me through it, and the only thing that I could say at the end was it's logical and it is internally consistent, but that is it. But you can make a logical argument that has false premises, and it's still a valid argument. If you are, as long as you don't take into account that the false premises can be debunked or removed, and then the whole thing falls apart. But I did say it's internally consistent, and that is absolutely true. After that, we got onto a conversation about Sidney Rigdon, because I made the argument. I told him about my Sunstone presentation video about Sidney Rigdon, the forgotten hero of Mormon history. And I said that, without Sidney Rigdon, I'm convinced that the church would not have survived, or it would have had to take many different paths to get to where it is today. And he agreed with both of those arguments. And he said that, he made the argument, as Joseph Smith said in a revelation, that Sidney Rigdon was sent forth as John the Baptist, essentially, to prepare the way for Joseph Smith and Mormonism. And that's only internally consistent if you grant the revelations that came out of Joseph Smith's mouth as actually coming from the same God that created the whole Jesus story, narrative, and everything involved with Jesus and John the Baptist. But it's only internally consistent, and I didn't argue with the fact that it doesn't stand up to actual scrutiny, especially when you begin questioning the very existence of Jesus Christ as a human being, or as being completely different from how the Gospels interpret the actual Jesus Christ. I didn't even get on those points because I didn't want to discuss that with him. That's not his expertise. His expertise is Kirtland and Mormon history. So we discussed Sidney Rigdon at length. And one question that I posed to him, I'm going to try and paraphrase it as best I can. I said, I make the argument that without Sidney Rigdon, the church wouldn't have survived. And what do you make of what do you make of the charge that Rigdon is more influential on Mormon history than he has been portrayed throughout Mormon history? And he essentially said that he loves Sidney Rigdon, and I said I do too, obviously, and that through his time that he fell away in the church. He was kind of absent throughout many of the Nauvoo years. He wasn't as much of a paramount piece of the puzzle, and therefore his fighting with Brigham Young after Joseph's death and the schism grenade went off, that he's just been kind of maligned throughout history, and he didn't think it was fair. Much in the way that I don't think that it's fair, the way that Sidney Rigdon has been interpreted. But then I went on to ask him about the presidential campaign of 1844, where Joseph Smith ran as president with Sidney Rigdon as vice president. I said, so what do you make of that, given Sidney Rigdon's, kind of the broader perception of Sidney Rigdon's influence and, his time in the Nauvoo years, where he was essentially absentee from the church? And he hearkened back to Van Wagner's work, and he said he really likes Van Wagner's book, Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Excess, but he doesn't necessarily agree with many of the conclusions that Van Wagner comes to. I don't know exactly what those were. He didn't define any of those when I pressed him on the issue, but he did say that coming up to the presidential bid, Sidney Rigdon had this time in, I think it was April, when he preached his sermon and he said, I'm healed, I'm back, I'm swinging, I'm ready to go. And then he was also, briefly, or for an amount of time, he was a resident in Pennsylvania. So Joseph knew that that was a big population state that would lend a lot of votes to a presidential campaign. So that's why Sidney Rigdon was chose over many other people that would have been better possible candidates. The logic is flawless. He's absolutely right. I couldn't argue with it. It seems completely accurate to me. I'd be open to a different interpretation of it, but that seems like the most logical way to look at the presidential campaign of 1844. And then after that, we discussed Sidney Rigdon a little bit more, and after that, that's when he says that when Anderson said that he loves Sidney Rigdon, and I said I do too. I think it's a tragedy what many Mormon historians have done to his name. But after that, I finally popped the question that I've been wanting to pop for the whole conversation, but I was waiting until the end of the conversation. We had 15 minutes left from our initial hour set time frame. And I posed the question to him. I said, Patriarch, how would you... I'm trying to think of exactly how I formulated the question, because I was very, very careful in what I said. I said, currently I am doing a fair amount of studying on Joseph Smith's possible use of plant medicines to elicit connections to divinity throughout the School of the Prophets, and possibly even before 1830, and then all culminating in the visionary experiences that happened in 1836. What would you say to that theory? And he said, the first reply he said was, I would throw it away. And I said, okay, that's very interesting. Let's dive into this a little bit deeper, knowing that we only had, 14 minutes left at that time to really get into this huge historical topic. So we did it. We got into it, and I posed some of the various accounts of which he's very familiar of the visionary experiences that happened not only in the Kirtland Temple, but also during the School of the Prophets and many other times throughout the early Mormon settlement in Kirtland, and, including on the Isaac Morley farm and whatnot. And I also posed the accusations that some people were claiming that the wine that they were using, their sacramental wine, was drugged. It was amended with something. And I don't know exactly how to recount the conversation. I was trying to internalize as much as he could say, because I'm looking for anybody who can shoot holes in this theory. And essentially the conversation evolved. I'm not going to say devolved. It evolved into me saying, I'm purely looking for a naturalistic explanation that explains all of the visionary experiences that these people had. And hallucinogens are one way to elicit those. And he said, well, it's not reliable because some people might take hallucinogens and they might see hell. It's not something that you have a very reliable method with, or, you'll have a reliable outcome with. And I took issue with that, because there's the hallucinogens that are the possible candidates. They're merely a catalyst by which these altered states of mind can be achieved. Some people get to those by meditation, others through breathing techniques, some through yoga. People get through get into these altered states of mind through all kinds of interesting mechanisms. And then, it just so happens that a large percentage of the population happen to respond positively and reliably to hallucinogens being used. And he likened it to a grand conspiracy theory. He said if this were happening, the people would have had to know what they were taking, and they would have to be expecting it. And also it would be necessary that every time they saw these things, that they would need to have imbibed before they had these visitations and saw these divine manifestations and these angelic visions and whatnot. I said I don't necessarily completely disagree with the point, but for the vast majority of these visitations, the men were, they were cleaned up, they had bathed and perfumed themselves, and they had been fasting the day before, or, the day of, before they went in to take the sacrament and then have these manifestations. And he made the argument that, especially like during the Doctrine and Covenants section 76 in the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, that they only imbibed in the wine after they had these visitations. And I said, I'm going to have to look into the history of that, because I'm not sure if I can agree or disagree with that. I need to look at the accounts more. And he made an appeal to his own authority by saying, I'm very familiar with these accounts, and I know for a fact that some of these people were seeing things before they ever drank any of the wine. And, I can't take his word for it. It's something that I need to look into deeper, but it doesn't necessarily violate the theory. It's not a falsifiable refutation of the claim, essentially, because these visionary experiences are just merely achieved by a catalyzing effect, and that catalyzing effect can be just these people gathering together and fasting and depriving themselves of nutrition, and then singing hymns and chanting and speaking in tongues and doing these various religious things that people have been doing forever prior to seeing these visions. And he went through some of the details of the visionary experiences that happened, and I was able to squeeze entheogens into every one of them, every single one. And by the end of the conversation, by the time we really were done, it was an hour. It was almost on the money, an hour and 45 minutes after I had sat down with him, and it was, long past the time that he had set out that he had made a time allowance for me. And I kept saying, I don't want to keep holding you up, but I have to say this, I have to say this. And, we kept it going back and forth. He wasn't trying to chase me out. I was trying to say, I'm trying to respect your time as much as possible. And I know that you normally don't do these kinds of meetings, so I really appreciate it and everything. But he essentially got to the point of saying, that leading down or going down this path of research isn't going to yield any good results. He said that there isn't anything good to glean from this. And I just categorically disagreed with him. And the reason why I think he disagrees with it so much is because it seems to take away from the divine nature of things, from the divine influence of these manifestations. If these people are all getting spectacularly fallen down drunk on some kind of wine tincture that has a hallucinogen infused in it, you don't necessarily need God to interfere with these things. But I also kept reiterating my point over and over, saying I'm looking for naturalistic explanations, because historians don't have access to saying that God did something. They can't say that this happened because God made it happen. Historians need naturalistic explanations. And finally, I posed a question to him. I said, is there another naturalistic explanation that exists that explains all of these manifestations? And he said, yes. These people, before they saw these visions, there were two requirements: that they had to be pure and that they had the Holy Ghost with them. You see the circular argumentation? I said there needs to be a naturalistic explanation without invoking God. And he said they were commanded that they needed to be cleaned, bathed, and pure, and they needed to be pure of heart, clean in all ways, and that they needed to be open to the Spirit. You're still inserting God's finger into that equation. There's still no naturalistic explanation that exists. He wasn't able to, at that time, articulate any naturalistic explanation. And by the end of the conversation, he was just saying that this is not the right path to go down, and that my time would be much better served in seeking choosing a different path and researching that. Also saying that the documentation will never exist for this. And I told him, well, we never thought that we would find the 1826 court document that, called Joseph Smith a glass looker. But lo and behold, with enough searching, we found the documentary evidence. And, he didn't have a refutation to that. He just kind of sat back and once again said that this is the wrong path of research, that nothing good will come from this. But he did apply it to his personal life. He's a patriarch here of the Kirtland stake. And he said, being a patriarch, I'm going to give a patriarch a blessing tomorrow. There's no way to know if I were to take a hallucinogen tonight, what would happen tomorrow, what I would say or do tomorrow. And I said, you're absolutely right, but it's all about, set and setting when it comes to imbibing hallucinogens. You can program, or, you can essentially program a trip. You can have a set and setting where you have a bunch of people gathering together and, chanting, singing, and whatnot, and getting closer to God. Or you can have, be in a bad set and setting and, have visions of hell fire and, all kinds of really terrifying things that, would be classified as a bad trip. And he did say, essentially that this is, when I asked him is there any level of evidence that would, convince that would convince you that this is the case. And he said that I know what I know, and I have had my own manifestations, and I don't need hallucinogens to explain those manifestations. And I said, okay, I have no want or ability to take that away from you, and that is not the purpose of this. I'm just seeking a naturalistic explanations for these visitations and these visions that the people experienced. And that was essentially the end of the conversation. And I'm only remembering that in much more detail and recounting that in much more detail because it was the most fresh thing on my mind. I literally drove to where I'm staying tonight after having this conversation, and I'm still sitting in my car talking to my recorder, just fresh after this conversation, 30 minutes after having it. So that's why I'm remembering it in so much detail. If the Kirtland tour, the Kirtland Temple tour, were the last thing that I did, I'd probably be recounting it in much more detail. But memory is a fickle thing, and that's why I'm doing these travel logs, so I don't forget anything. But I guess that was today. Tomorrow is going to be exciting. I have a discussion lined up with Seth Bryant, who is a historian with the Community of Christ. And, I'm hoping that he will agree to be interviewed and come on the podcast. And I'll save the recording for when we go back on air here in May. May the 4th be with you. And that's on the docket for tomorrow. And I'm stoked about it. We'll see how everything goes. But yeah, as always, thanks for listening. Sorry about all the extra noise, but one little quick thing to splice in here. For those who are listening along as these come out, we are doing our third installment of Name a Home Evening tomorrow night from when this airs. That is going to be on April 3rd, Monday night, the first Monday of every month as usual. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to discuss with you anything about this Mormon history tour as it's progressing. So yeah, hope to see some of you there.